In the summer of 1943, when the world was drowning in the darkness of war, a young woman named Sarah Chun made a decision that would either save thousands of lives or cost her everything she held dear. Standing at the edge of a forest that marked the boundary between occupied and free territory, she clutched a small leather bag containing secrets that could change the course of history. Behind her lay safety, family, and the life she had always known. Ahead stretched miles of enemy-controlled land, where every shadow could hide a soldier's rifle and every stranger could be her last encounter. What drove this ordinary schoolteacher to become an extraordinary spy? What made her believe she could succeed where trained military operatives had failed? And how did her solitary mission behind enemy lines ultimately reshape not just the war, but the very definition of courage itself? This is the story of how one woman's impossible journey into the heart of darkness became a beacon of hope for an entire resistance movement. It's a tale of survival, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to surrender even when facing impossible odds. Most importantly, it's the true account of how Sarah Chun entered enemy territory alone and changed everything. Sarah Chun had never imagined that her greatest lesson would be taught outside any classroom. 3 months before that fateful summer evening, she had been grading arithmetic papers by candlelight in her small apartment above the village school. The war seemed distant then, something that happened in newspapers and radio broadcasts, not in their quiet mountain community where the biggest excitement was usually the annual harvest festival. The first sign that everything would change came on a Tuesday morning when old Mrs. Petrov burst into Sarah's classroom, tears streaming down her weathered face. Her grandson, barely 17, had been taken by the occupation forces along with 12 other young men from the village. They had been accused of sabotaging supply lines, though everyone knew the boys had been nowhere near the main roads when the attacks occurred. Sarah watched her students' faces that day, seeing fear replace the innocent curiosity she had grown to love. These children, some as young as 8, now understood that their world was no longer safe. Their questions had changed from, "When will we learn about fractions?" to "Will Papa come home tonight?" She realized that teaching them to read and write meant nothing if they might not live to use those skills. The transformation began slowly. Sarah started listening more carefully to the adult conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. She noticed the way certain villagers would disappear for days at a time, returning with haunted expressions and careful words. Most importantly, she began to understand that her position as the village teacher gave her access to something precious in wartime: information. Children talked freely around their teacher, sharing overheard conversations from their homes. Parents confided in her about their fears and plans. Even the local officials, who had been installed by the occupation government, treated her with the respect accorded to an educated woman. Without realizing it, Sarah had become a repository of intelligence about troop movements, supply schedules, and the growing network of resistance activities in the region. The evening that changed everything started like many others. Sarah was preparing lessons for the next day when a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Marcus Weber, a man she knew only by sight. He was one of those villagers who seemed to fade into the background, unremarkable in every way except for his eyes, which missed nothing. Marcus stepped inside without invitation, glancing around the small room before speaking. His voice was quiet, measured, and completely certain. He told Sarah that the resistance needed her, not just her information, but her personally. There was a mission that required someone the enemy would never suspect, someone who could travel through checkpoints without raising questions, someone who looked exactly like what she was, an innocent schoolteacher. The plan he outlined seemed impossible. Deep in enemy territory, nearly 200 miles from their village, lay a detention camp where captured resistance fighters were being held before transport to permanent prisons. Among them was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a brilliant scientist whose knowledge of code breaking had made her invaluable to the resistance effort. The enemy didn't yet know the true value of their prisoner, but they would soon. Dr. Vasquez had perhaps 2 weeks before her identity was discovered, and she was moved to a high-security facility from which rescue would be impossible. Sarah's mission would be to reach the camp, make contact with Dr. Vasquez, and help coordinate her escape. It sounded simple when Marcus explained it, But Sarah understood the reality. The journey would take her through multiple checkpoints, across territories controlled by different military units, and into areas where civilians were viewed with suspicion, if not outright hostility. She would be completely alone, with no backup plan and no guarantee of rescue if things went wrong. The logical response would have been to refuse. Sarah had no training in espionage, no experience with weapons, and no knowledge of the harsh realities of life in occupied territory. She was a teacher who had never traveled more than 50 miles from her birthplace, whose greatest adventure had been a school trip to the regional library. Yet as Marcus spoke, Sarah found herself thinking not about her own fears, but about her students. She remembered 9-year-old Anna, whose father had been arrested for refusing to reveal the location of hidden grain stores. She thought about teenage Peter, who had stopped smiling after his older brother disappeared one night and never returned. Most of all, she remembered the question that little Tommy had asked her just that morning. "Miss Chun, why do bad people always win?" Sarah had given him the standard adult answer about good ultimately triumphing, but the words had felt hollow even as she spoke them. Now, sitting across from Marcus in her tiny apartment, she realized that platitudes about good and evil meant nothing without action. Her students needed to see that sometimes ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things. They needed to believe that teachers, like the heroes in their storybooks, could fight dragons. The practical details that Marcus shared over the next 2 hours were both reassuring and terrifying. The resistance had established safe houses along the route, though Sarah would need to be extremely careful about how and when she approached them. She would carry identification papers marking her as a substitute teacher being transferred to a school near the detention camp. The story was plausible enough to get her through most checkpoints, especially since the occupation forces were always struggling to find qualified educators for the territories under their control. Sarah would carry her intelligence hidden in the most obvious place possible, her teaching materials. Lesson plans, children's essays, and educational supplies would conceal maps, codes, and communication tools. The enemy would see exactly what they expected to see: a dedicated teacher carrying the tools of her trade to her new assignment. The weapons she would carry were equally invisible. Marcus taught her how common household items could become tools of survival and escape. A sewing kit could pick locks, a hand mirror could send signals, and even her teacher's whistle could serve as a distraction or call for help. Most importantly, her greatest weapon would be her ability to appear completely harmless and ordinary. Training began immediately, though it had to be conducted in complete secrecy. Late at night, after the village had gone to sleep, Marcus would meet Sarah in the old grain storage building behind the school. He taught her how to move silently, how to observe without appearing to watch, and how to memorize faces and details that might prove crucial later. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a building was being watched, how to identify different types of military vehicles by their sound, and, most crucially, how to maintain her cover story under pressure. The hardest part was learning to think like someone other than herself. Sarah had always been straightforward and honest, qualities that served her well as a teacher but could prove fatal as a spy. She had to practice lying convincingly, creating elaborate backstories that she could maintain under interrogation. She learned to suppress her natural reactions of fear or surprise, to keep her face neutral when witnessing things that shocked or horrified her. Physical preparation proved equally challenging. The journey would require her to walk long distances, often at night, and across difficult terrain. Sarah had always been healthy, but she had never tested her endurance under conditions of stress and danger. She began taking long walks in the mountains around their village, gradually building up her strength and stamina. She learned to move quietly through brush and rocks, to find her way using stars and landmarks when roads were too dangerous to follow. The first checkpoint appeared through the morning mist like something from Sarah's worst nightmares. 2 days of walking through mountain paths had brought her to the main road that would carry her deep into enemy territory. Behind her lay the familiar world of her village, now invisible beyond the rolling hills. Ahead stretched a future that could unfold in 1,000 different ways, most of them ending in capture or death. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her worn leather satchel, and approached the wooden barrier that blocked the road. 3 soldiers emerged from their guard post, their uniforms crisp despite the early hour, their weapons clean and ready. She forced herself to remember Marcus's training, appear tired but not nervous, cooperative but not eager, exactly what she claimed to be, a teacher traveling to her new assignment. The sergeant who examined her papers was younger than she had expected, perhaps only a few years older than her oldest students. His accent marked him as a foreigner, one of the occupation troops brought in from distant provinces to ensure loyalty to the central government. Sarah watched his face as he read her identification documents, searching for any sign that her cover story was failing. The questions came in a bored, routine tone that somehow made them more frightening than shouted demands would have been. Where was she traveling? Why was she alone? What did she plan to teach at her new school? Sarah answered each question exactly as she had practiced, adding small details that made her story believable without making it memorable. She mentioned her nervousness about teaching older students, her hope that the mountain air would help her persistent cough, her concern about finding decent lodging in an unfamiliar town. When the sergeant opened her satchel to examine its contents, Sarah's heart nearly stopped beating. Hidden among her legitimate teaching materials were the tools of her secret mission. Coded messages disguised as lesson plans, maps drawn on the backs of student essays, communication devices sewn into the lining of her notebooks. If the soldiers looked too carefully, if they questioned why a math teacher needed so many geography materials, if they noticed that some of her student work was written in handwriting too mature for children, her mission would end before it had truly begun. But the soldiers saw exactly what they expected to see, the boring, mundane possessions of a village school teacher. They glanced at her arithmetic books, flipped through her collection of children's stories, and examined her teaching supplies with the casual disinterest of men who had searched thousands of similar bags. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the sergeant handed her papers back and waved her through the checkpoint. Sarah's relief was so intense that she almost stumbled as she walked past the barrier. She had passed her first test, but she knew it was only the beginning. The road ahead would take her through dozens of similar checkpoints, each one representing another opportunity for discovery and disaster. More importantly, she was now officially in enemy territory, where every person she met might be a potential threat. The landscape changed gradually as Sarah continued her journey. The comfortable familiarity of mountain villages gave way to agricultural plains where the war's impact was visible in abandoned farmhouses and overgrown fields. The few people she encountered on the road moved with the careful, watchful manner of those who had learned that drawing attention could be dangerous. Conversations were brief and guarded, focused on practical matters like weather and road conditions rather than personal details or political opinions. Sarah's first night away from home was spent in a barn belonging to a farmer who asked no questions and expected no explanations. The man simply pointed to a corner where she could spread her blanket, provided a simple meal of bread and milk, and made it clear that she should be gone before dawn. The silence between them was filled with mutual understanding. They were both taking risks that could prove fatal if discovered, and the less they knew about each other, the safer they would both be. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the sounds of military vehicles passing on the nearby road, and the constant awareness that she was alone in hostile territory. Sarah found herself thinking about her students, wondering if they had noticed her absence yet, whether her replacement would understand the careful notes she had left about each child's particular needs and challenges. The familiar concerns of a teacher seemed to belong to a different world, one where the greatest danger was a scraped knee during recess. The second day brought Sarah to a larger town where her teaching credentials would be put to a different kind of test. Her cover story required her to report to the local education office, where she would receive official authorization to continue to her supposed new assignment. The building housing the education department had once been a prosperous merchant's home, but it now bore the utilitarian modifications that marked all government facilities in occupied territory: reinforced windows, additional guards, and the ever-present portraits of official leaders. The woman who interviewed Sarah was a local who had managed to retain her position by demonstrating absolute loyalty to the new regime. Her questions were more detailed and professionally informed than those of the soldiers at the checkpoint. She wanted to see examples of Sarah's lesson plans, discuss her teaching philosophy, and examine her credentials with the practiced eye of an experienced educator. Sarah found herself answering questions about pedagogical theory and classroom management techniques, while simultaneously trying to remember which of her materials contained hidden intelligence. The interview stretched on for nearly 2 hours, during which Sarah had to demonstrate not only her teaching competence, but also her political reliability. She was asked about her opinion of the new educational policies, her willingness to incorporate approved ideological content into her lessons, and her understanding of the importance of molding young minds according to officially sanctioned principles. Each answer had to strike a delicate balance between appearing enthusiastic enough to be believable while not being so zealous as to attract unwanted attention. Finally, the education official stamped Sarah's travel papers with the authorization that would allow her to continue her journey. As she walked out of the building, Sarah realized that she had just successfully impersonated not only a teacher, but a collaborator. The role left a bitter taste in her mouth, but she understood that survival in enemy territory required her to become whatever the situation demanded. The road to her next destination took Sarah through increasingly militarized areas. Troop convoys became more frequent, their vehicles kicking up clouds of dust that forced pedestrians to the roadside. Military camps appeared on hillsides, their rows of tents and organized activity a stark reminder of the occupation force's presence. Sarah learned to time her movements to avoid the busiest periods, traveling early in the morning and late in the evening when traffic was lighter and security less intense. Her third night brought her to one of the safe houses that Marcus had described during her briefing. The building appeared to be an ordinary boarding house catering to traveling merchants and minor officials. Sarah approached it with carefully rehearsed casualness, asking for a room and mentioning the specific phrase that would identify her to any resistance contacts. The proprietor, a middle-aged woman with prematurely gray hair, showed no reaction to the code words, but Sarah noticed the subtle nod that indicated her message had been received and understood. The room Sarah was given was small and spartanly furnished, but it felt like luxury after 2 nights of sleeping rough. More importantly, it provided her with her first opportunity since leaving home to make contact with the resistance network. Late that evening, a soft knock at her door announced the arrival of her contact, a man who introduced himself only as David and spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to coordinating dangerous operations. David's briefing updated Sarah on conditions along her route and provided crucial intelligence about the detention camp that was her ultimate destination. The news was both encouraging and alarming. Dr. Vasquez was indeed being held at the facility, but recent security upgrades had made the camp significantly more difficult to approach. Additionally, intelligence suggested that the enemy was beginning to suspect Dr. Vasquez's true value and might accelerate the timeline for her transfer to a more secure location. The updated mission parameters required Sarah to take greater risks than originally planned. Instead of simply establishing contact and coordinating a rescue attempt, she would need to gather detailed intelligence about the camp's layout, security procedures, and guard schedules. This information would be essential for the rescue team that would follow her, but obtaining it would require Sarah to operate much closer to the facility than anyone had initially anticipated. David also provided Sarah with additional equipment that had been too dangerous to carry during her journey. A small radio transmitter disguised as a medical device, emergency currency that could be used for bribes or transportation, and, most ominously, a suicide pill concealed in what appeared to be an ordinary vitamin tablet. The message was clear. The resistance considered this mission critical enough to accept significant casualties, and Sarah was expected to ensure that valuable intelligence didn't fall into enemy hands even if it meant sacrificing her own life. The weight of her true mission settled on Sarah's shoulders as she prepared to leave the safe house the following morning. She was no longer just a courier carrying messages or a scout gathering general information. She had become a deep-cover operative whose success or failure could determine the fate of one of the Resistance's most valuable assets. The scared school teacher who had left her village 4 days earlier was gone, replaced by someone harder and more focused. someone capable of making the terrible decisions that were demanded. The schoolhouse where Sarah would establish her cover was a gray stone building that had seen better days. Built before the war, it now served the children of guards, administrative staff, and local civilians who worked to support the detention facility. The irony was not lost on Sarah that she would be teaching the children of the very people who held Dr. Vasquez prisoner. But she understood that this proximity was also her greatest opportunity. Sarah's first morning as a substitute teacher began with 23 pairs of young eyes examining her with the mixture of curiosity and skepticism that all children reserved for new authority figures. She had spent years perfecting her ability to win over a classroom, but never under circumstances where failure could mean death for both her and the person she had come to rescue. As she introduced herself and began the day's lessons, Sarah forced herself to focus on the familiar rhythms of teaching while part of her mind constantly analyzed every sound from outside, every face that appeared at the classroom windows. The children were not so different from her students back home, despite the unique circumstances of their lives. 8-year-old Emma worried about her arithmetic homework with the same intensity that Sarah remembered from dozens of other children. Teenage Klaus struggled with the same awkwardness and bravado that marked adolescent boys everywhere. But there were differences too. These children spoke casually of guard rotations and security procedures, treated the sight of armed soldiers as normal, and had been raised in an environment where loyalty to authority was not just expected but essential for survival. During her lunch break, Sarah walked around the town with the casual aimlessness of someone exploring a new community. In reality, every step was calculated to gather intelligence about the detention facility that dominated the local landscape. She noted which buildings had clear sight lines to the camp, identified potential escape routes, and, most importantly, observed the patterns of daily life that might provide opportunities for her real mission. The town existed almost entirely to support the detention facility. The local shops catered to guards and administrative staff, the in-housed visitors and temporary personnel, and even the church seemed to focus its sermons on themes of duty and obedience. Sarah realized that everyone here was connected to the camp in some way, which made her mission both more dangerous and more promising. If she could find the right contacts, people with access to information or influence within the facility, she might be able to accomplish far more than originally planned. Her opportunity came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, the wife of a senior guard, had enrolled her 10-year-old daughter in Sarah's class after the previous teacher had left suddenly. Maria was intelligent, well-educated, and clearly frustrated by the limitations of her current life. During a parent conference, she confided to Sarah that she had once been a teacher herself, before the war, and her marriage had changed her circumstances. The conversation revealed a woman hungry for intellectual stimulation and meaningful work, someone who might be sympathetic to the right kind of appeal. Sarah began cultivating her relationship with Maria carefully, using their shared background in education as a foundation for deeper conversations. She learned that Maria had access to the facility's administrative records through her husband's position, that she was responsible for coordinating educational services for the children of imprisoned political prisoners, and, most importantly, that she harbored serious doubts about the justice of the current system. The pieces of a plan began forming in Sarah's mind, but she knew that any approach would have to be managed with extraordinary delicacy. The breakthrough came during Sarah's third week in town, when a medical emergency at the detention facility created an opportunity she had not anticipated. Dr. Vasquez, while maintaining her cover as an ordinary political prisoner, had been providing informal medical care to fellow inmates. When a young prisoner suffered a severe allergic reaction that the facility's regular medical staff couldn't handle, Dr. Vasquez's intervention saved the girl's life and revealed her true medical expertise. Maria Santos witnessed this incident while delivering educational materials to the facility, and she confided her confusion to Sarah during their regular evening walks. How could an ordinary political prisoner possess such advanced medical knowledge? Why would someone with such valuable skills be imprisoned for minor resistance activities? The questions revealed that Maria was beginning to suspect there was more to Dr. Vasquez than appeared in her official file. Sarah realized that Maria's growing awareness created both an opportunity and a danger. If Maria became curious enough to investigate further, she might uncover Dr. Vasquez's true identity and value to the resistance. This could lead to increased security that would make rescue impossible, but it could also provide Sarah with the inside information she needed to coordinate an escape attempt. The decision she faced was whether to trust Maria with the truth or find a way to manipulate her without revealing the full scope of the situation. The choice was made for her when Maria approached Sarah with a proposition that revealed just how far her thinking had evolved. Speaking in careful, coded language during their evening walk, Maria suggested that certain prisoners with valuable skills might be better served by opportunities to use those abilities outside the confines of the detention facility. She hinted that there were people within the administrative structure who had grown uncomfortable with the harsh treatment of political prisoners, especially those whose only crime was opposition to policies they considered unjust. Sarah recognized that Maria was essentially offering to help with a prisoner escape, though neither woman was yet ready to speak so directly. Over the following days, their conversations became more specific and more dangerous. Maria revealed details about security procedures, guard schedules, and administrative protocols that would be essential for any rescue attempt. In return, Sarah shared carefully selected information about resistance networks and escape routes, always presenting the details as theoretical rather than operational. The plan that emerged from their collaboration was audacious in its simplicity. Dr. Vasquez would be temporarily transferred from the main detention facility to the medical clinic in town, officially for treatment of a recurring health condition that Maria would arrange to have documented. During this transfer, while Dr. Vasquez was under minimal security at the clinic, Sarah would make contact and coordinate the final phase of the escape. The timing would have to be perfect, as they would have only a few hours before Dr. Vasquez was expected to return to the facility. Implementing the plan required Sarah to take risks that went far beyond anything she had imagined when she first accepted the mission. She had to forge medical documents that would justify the transfer, coordinate with resistance contacts she had never met to arrange transportation, and prepare contingency plans for dozens of scenarios that could lead to disaster. Most challenging of all, she had to maintain her cover as an innocent school teacher while orchestrating one of the most complex operations she had ever heard of. The preparation phase revealed aspects of her personality that Sarah had never known existed. She discovered that she could lie convincingly to people she genuinely liked, manipulate situations to serve her hidden agenda, and make calculations about acceptable risks that would have horrified her former self. The village school teacher who had been afraid to speak up at faculty meetings had become someone capable of planning operations that could save or doom multiple lives. Maria's husband, Sergeant Santos, unknowingly provided crucial intelligence during dinner conversations that Maria carefully steered toward topics relevant to the escape plan. Sarah learned about upcoming changes in guard assignments, planned security upgrades, and, most importantly, a temporary reduction in facility staffing that would create a narrow window of opportunity. The information came at great personal cost to Maria, who was increasingly torn between loyalty to her husband and her growing commitment to the rescue operation. As the date for the escape attempt approached, Sarah found herself at the medical clinic stood at the corner of two quiet streets, a modest building that had served the town's health needs for decades. On this particular morning, it was about to become the focal point of an operation that could change the course of the war. Sarah arrived for her scheduled volunteer work at the clinic 30 minutes early, using the extra time to position herself where she could observe both the building's entrances and the road that led from the detention facility. Dr. Vasquez arrived in the back of a military vehicle at precisely 10 o'clock, accompanied by two guards who seemed more bored than alert. The prisoner appeared smaller than Sarah had expected, a woman in her early 40s whose slight build made her seem almost fragile in her gray institutional clothing. But there was something in her bearing, a quiet dignity that suggested reserves of strength that were not immediately apparent. This was the woman whose knowledge could help break enemy codes, whose freedom was worth the enormous risks that Sarah and Maria had taken to arrange this moment. The medical examination had been scheduled to last 2 hours, providing a narrow window for Sarah to make contact and coordinate the escape. Maria's forged paperwork had justified the extended appointment by documenting a complex condition that required extensive testing and consultation. The guards, who were accustomed to routine medical visits that proceeded without incident, settled into the clinic's waiting area with the relaxed attention of men who expected nothing more challenging than an uneventful morning. Sarah's role was officially that of a volunteer assistant, helping with patient records and basic administrative tasks. This position gave her legitimate access to the medical records area where Dr. Vasquez would be examined, while allowing her to move freely throughout the building without raising suspicion. She had spent hours familiarizing herself with the clinic's layout, identifying escape routes, and emergency procedures that might prove crucial if the operation went wrong. The initial contact came sooner than expected. While the clinic's doctor was reviewing Dr. Vasquez's medical files in preparation for the examination, Sarah was asked to escort the patient to a preliminary screening room. For the first time since leaving her village 6 weeks earlier, she found herself alone with the woman she had risked everything to rescue. Dr. Vasquez looked up as Sarah entered the room, and their eyes met in a moment of mutual recognition that transcended words. Neither woman spoke immediately, but Sarah could see intelligence and wariness in the doctor's expression, the careful evaluation of someone who had learned to assess potential threats and allies quickly. Sarah moved to the window and adjusted the blinds in a specific pattern that served as the recognition signal she and Marcus had established during her training. The doctor's reaction was immediate and subtle. A slight nod confirmed that she understood the signal and was prepared to cooperate with whatever rescue attempt was unfolding. Speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, Dr. Vasquez confirmed her identity using code phrases that proved she was indeed the person Sarah had been sent to rescue. More importantly, she provided crucial information about recent developments that could affect their escape plans. The enemy had indeed begun to suspect Dr. Vasquez's true value, but they had not yet confirmed her identity. Recent interrogations had focused on her background and education, suggesting that they were close to making the connection between the seemingly ordinary political prisoner and the brilliant cryptographer who had been helping to break their communication codes. Time was running out even faster than Sarah had realized. If they failed to execute the escape today, there might not be another opportunity. Dr. Vasquez also revealed information that added new urgency to the mission. She had been working with other prisoners to document war crimes and human rights violations within the detention system. This information, if it could be smuggled out along with Dr. Vasquez herself, would provide the resistance with evidence that could be used to rally international support for their cause. The stakes of the rescue had suddenly increased beyond the simple extraction of a valuable individual. The escape plan required careful timing and perfect execution. At exactly 11:30, during a shift change that would reduce the number of guards in the clinic to a minimum, Sarah would create a distraction that would allow Dr. Vasquez to slip away from the medical facility. Maria had arranged for a delivery truck to be positioned behind the clinic, ostensibly making a routine supply delivery, but actually providing transportation to the first safe house on the escape route. As the appointed time approached, Sarah found her hands trembling with nervous energy. Everything they had worked for over the past month would succeed or fail in the next 30 minutes. She thought about her students back home, wondering if they would be proud of their teacher if they knew what she was attempting. She thought about the resistance fighters who were counting on Dr. Vasquez's safe return, and about the countless lives that might be saved if the operation succeeded. The distraction came in the form of a carefully orchestrated medical emergency. Maria Santos arrived at the clinic with her daughter, claiming that the child had suffered an allergic reaction that required immediate attention. The incident was genuine enough to demand the guards' attention while providing sufficient chaos to mask Dr. Vasquez's disappearance. As the clinic staff rushed to respond to the medical crisis, Sarah guided the doctor through a series of corridors that led to the building's rear exit. The escape itself unfolded with surprising smoothness. Dr. Vasquez proved to be remarkably calm under pressure, following Sarah's directions without question while maintaining the appearance of a routine patient transfer. They encountered only one potentially dangerous moment when a security guard asked about their destination. But Sarah's explanation that they were moving to a different examination room was accepted without further inquiry. The delivery truck was waiting exactly where Maria had promised, its engine running and rear doors open. The driver, a resistance operative whom Sarah had never met, gestured them inside without speaking. As Dr. Vasquez climbed into the vehicle, she paused to clasp Sarah's hand in a gesture of gratitude that conveyed more than words could express. Then, she was gone, disappearing into the truck's cargo area along with the precious intelligence documents she had managed to smuggle out of the detention facility. Sarah remained at the clinic, maintaining her volunteer duties as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The deception would only hold for another hour or two before Dr. Vasquez's absence was discovered, but that should be sufficient time for the escape party to reach the first safe house and begin the long journey back to resistance territory. Every minute that passed without an alarm being raised increased the chances that the operation would ultimately succeed. The discovery came exactly 97 minutes after the escape, when guards conducting a routine check found the examination room empty. The alarm that followed was everything Sarah had feared. Sirens wailing throughout the town, checkpoints being established on every road, houses being searched by armed soldiers who seemed convinced that enemy agents were operating in their midst. Sarah watched the chaos unfold from the clinic's windows, knowing that her own freedom now depended entirely on the strength of her cover story and the quality of her acting abilities. The interrogation that followed was the most terrifying experience of Sarah's life. She was questioned for 6 straight hours by investigators who seemed convinced that the escape had required inside assistance. They demanded detailed accounts of her activities, her interactions with clinic staff and patients, and her observations of anything unusual that had occurred during the day. Sarah answered every question with the careful precision of someone who had nothing to hide, while fighting down the panic that threatened to overwhelm her composure. Maria Santos was also interrogated, and Sarah knew that if either of them broke under pressure, both would likely be executed as enemy collaborators. The waiting was almost unbearable, as Sarah had no way of knowing whether Maria was maintaining their agreed-upon story or whether crucial details were being revealed that would expose the entire operation. She could only trust in the strength and intelligence of a woman who had already proven herself capable of extraordinary courage. The breakthrough that saved them came from an unexpected source. The journey home began 3 days after Dr. Vasquez's successful escape, when the initial security crackdown had relaxed enough to make travel possible again. Sarah's departure from the town near the detention facility was as carefully orchestrated as every other aspect of her mission. She submitted formal paperwork requesting a transfer back to her original school district, citing family obligations and health concerns that made her current assignment unsuitable for long-term continuation. The education officials who processed her request saw exactly what they expected to see: a village teacher who had completed a temporary assignment and was eager to return to familiar surroundings. Her performance had been satisfactory, but unremarkable. Her behavior appropriately respectful to authority while maintaining the slightly nervous demeanor expected from someone used to life in heavily militarized areas. They stamped her travel papers without suspicion, never imagining that the mousy woman requesting transfer was the same person who had orchestrated the most embarrassing security breach in their sector's recent history. Sarah's route home deliberately avoided the path she had taken 6 weeks earlier. The resistance had arranged safe houses along a different corridor, one that would take her through industrial areas where worker shortages had created opportunities for travelers to blend into crowds of legitimate job seekers. The journey would take longer than her original route, but it offered better security and reduced the chances of encountering checkpoints where guards might remember her previous passage. The woman who began the return journey was fundamentally different from the frightened teacher who had first left her village. Sarah moved with new confidence, her eyes constantly scanning for potential threats while her demeanor remained outwardly calm. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when situations were becoming dangerous, to trust her instincts about people and circumstances, and, most importantly, to maintain her composure under extreme pressure. The first several days of travel passed without significant incident. Sarah encountered the usual checkpoints and document inspections, but her papers were in perfect order and her cover story held up under routine questioning. She was once again a teacher returning from a temporary assignment, carrying the normal possessions of someone in her profession, displaying the appropriate mixture of fatigue and relief that marked the end of an arduous but successful work placement. The real test came when Sarah reached the industrial city of Moravec, a manufacturing center that served as a crucial transportation hub for the region. Security there was more sophisticated than anything she had previously encountered, with multiple layers of document verification and questioning designed to catch infiltrators and enemy agents. Sarah knew that this checkpoint represented the most dangerous obstacle between her and home, but she also understood that successfully passing through it would virtually guarantee her safe return. The interrogation at Moravec lasted 4 hours and involved 3 different officials who seemed determined to find inconsistencies in her story. They questioned her about her teaching assignment, her reasons for requesting transfer, her observations of security conditions in the area she was leaving, and her opinions about recent disturbances that had disrupted normal operations at various facilities. Sarah answered each question with the careful honesty of someone who had nothing to hide, while avoiding any details that might connect her to the escape that had occurred days earlier. The most dangerous moment came when one of the interrogators produced a photograph of Dr. Vasquez and asked whether Sarah had ever seen the woman during her time at the clinic. Sarah's heart nearly stopped as she recognized the image, but she forced herself to study it with the mild curiosity of someone trying to be helpful. After a moment that felt like an eternity, she shook her head and explained that she had only worked with routine patient records and had never been involved in treating political prisoners or other special cases. The answer satisfied the investigators, who were clearly fishing for information rather than following any specific leads. Sarah was eventually released with the standard warnings about reporting suspicious activity and maintaining proper documentation during travel. As she walked away from the security building, she realized that she had just passed the final major test of her mission. The remaining journey to resistance territory would involve routine travel through areas where her identity and presence would not attract special attention. 2 days later, Sarah reached the edge of free territory, marked by the familiar sight of resistance checkpoints and the friendly faces of guards who recognized her as one of their own. The relief she felt at seeing the improvised barriers and makeshift uniforms of the freedom fighters was overwhelming, representing not just personal safety, but the successful completion of a mission that had seemed impossible when she first accepted it. The debriefing took place in a farmhouse that served as a regional command center, where Sarah spent hours providing detailed intelligence about everything she had observed during her time behind enemy lines. Military commanders listened intently as she described troop movements, security procedures, civilian morale, and the countless small details that could prove valuable for future operations. Her information would help plan other missions and rescue attempts, ensuring that her success would contribute to broader strategic objectives. But the most important part of the debriefing focused on Dr. Vasquez and the intelligence documents that had been smuggled out of the detention facility. The rescued scientist had already begun working with resistance cryptographers, using her expertise to break enemy communication codes that had previously been impenetrable. The information she provided was revolutionizing the Resistance's understanding of enemy plans and capabilities, giving them strategic advantages that were already affecting the course of the war. The documents that Dr. Vasquez had carried out of the prison were equally valuable, providing detailed evidence of systematic abuses and war crimes that international observers were finding impossible to ignore. The testimonies and documentation that Sarah had helped smuggle were already being used to build legal cases that would outlast the immediate conflict, ensuring that those responsible for atrocities would eventually face justice for their actions. As the formal debriefing concluded, Sarah found herself thinking about the personal cost of her transformation from teacher to operative. She had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, but the experience had changed her in ways that might never be completely reversible. The woman who returned to her village would carry secrets and memories that she could never fully share, experiences that would forever separate her from the simple certainties of her former life. The reunion with her students was both joyful and bittersweet. They welcomed their teacher back with the enthusiasm that children reserve for beloved adults who had been absent too long. eager to share everything that had happened during her time away. Sarah listened to their stories and examined their schoolwork with genuine pleasure, but part of her remained alert for potential threats and suspicious circumstances. The habits of survival that had kept her alive in enemy territory could not be easily discarded, even in the safety of her own classroom. Sarah's parents, who had never known the true nature of her absence, accepted her explanation that she had been fulfilling a special teaching assignment in a distant district. They were concerned about her obvious weight loss and the subtle signs of stress that she could not entirely conceal, but they attributed these changes to the difficulties of working in an unfamiliar environment during wartime. Sarah did not correct their assumptions, understanding that some burdens were too dangerous to share even with those closest to her. The resistance leadership offered Sarah opportunities for advanced training and additional missions, recognizing that her success had proven her exceptional capabilities for intelligence work. But Sarah declined these offers, choosing instead to return to her primary identity as a village teacher. She had accomplished something extraordinary, but she had also discovered that her greatest satisfaction came from the ordinary work of educating children and serving her community. This decision did not mean that Sarah's contribution to the resistance effort was over. Her position as a respected teacher gave her access to information and influence that could prove valuable in future emergencies. She agreed to serve as a contact point for other operations, providing safe houses and communication services as needed. But her primary focus would remain on the classroom and the students who needed her skills and dedication. The story of Sarah's mission became legend within resistance circles, though the details were never fully revealed for security reasons. She became known simply as the teacher, a symbol of how ordinary citizens could contribute to extraordinary causes when they chose to act on their convictions rather than simply hoping that someone else would solve the world's problems. Her example inspired other civilians to accept dangerous assignments, creating a network of unexpected heroes who proved that courage was not the exclusive province of professional soldiers. Dr. Elena Vasquez personally requested a meeting with Sarah after her return, wanting to thank the woman who had risked everything to secure her freedom. Their conversation, held in a secure location far from their original meeting place, focused on the broader implications of what they had accomplished together. Both women understood that their success had demonstrated something important about the power of individual action and the possibility of achieving goals that seemed impossible when approached with sufficient determination and careful planning. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from Sarah's students, who sensed that their teacher had changed in important ways even if they could not understand the specifics. They noticed that she seemed more confident and decisive, more willing to challenge them with difficult questions and higher expectations. They observed that she spoke more frequently about courage, justice, and the importance of standing up for what was right, even when doing so required personal sacrifice. Years later, when the war had ended and the full story could finally be told, Sarah's students would learn that their mild-mannered teacher had been one of the heroes of the resistance movement. They would discover that the woman who had patiently helped them with arithmetic and grammar had also planned and executed one of the most successful rescue operations of the entire conflict. Most importantly, they would understand that their teacher's greatest lesson had been taught not through words but through actions that demonstrated the extraordinary potential that existed within ordinary people. Sarah Chun had entered enemy territory alone and changed everything, not through any miraculous abilities or special training, but simply by refusing to accept that extraordinary things were impossible. She had proven that teachers could be heroes, that courage could be learned, and that the most important battles were sometimes fought not by armies but by individuals who chose to act on their convictions despite overwhelming odds. The village school where Sarah resumed her teaching career looked exactly the same as when she had left it months earlier, but everything had changed. The woman standing at the blackboard was still a teacher, but she was also a proven operative who had succeeded where military specialists might have failed. Her students were still children learning to read and write, but they were also future citizens who would grow up understanding that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept that extraordinary things were impossible. In the end, Sarah's greatest victory was not the successful rescue of Dr. Vasquez or the intelligence she had gathered during her mission. It was the demonstration that courage, determination, and careful planning could overcome almost any obstacle, and that the most important qualification for heroism was not special training or natural ability, but simply the willingness to act when action was needed. She had entered enemy territory as a frightened teacher and returned as an inspiration to everyone who believed that individual actions could change the world. During the investigation, authorities discovered evidence that seemed to point toward a completely different explanation for Dr. Vasquez's escape. Papers planted by resistance operatives suggested that the prisoner had been freed by a team of commandos who had infiltrated the area weeks earlier. The evidence was convincing enough to shift the investigation away from local collaborators and toward the hunt for these fictional military specialists. Sarah was released after 14 hours of detention, officially cleared of any involvement in the escape, but warned that she would remain under surveillance as a precaution. She returned to her boarding house room exhausted but triumphant, knowing that Dr. Vasquez was now beyond the reach of her captors and probably already providing valuable intelligence to resistance commanders. The mission that had seemed impossible 6 weeks earlier had succeeded against all odds. The celebration was necessarily private and brief. Sarah could not risk any behavior that might attract renewed attention from security forces who were still searching frantically for signs of enemy activity. She maintained her teaching duties and community responsibilities exactly as before, giving no indication that she had recently participated in one of the most audacious rescue operations of the war. Word of the successful escape reached Sarah through carefully coded messages that appeared to be routine correspondence about educational matters. Dr. Vasquez had reached safety and was already contributing to the war effort in ways that justified every risk that had been taken to secure her freedom. The intelligence documents she had smuggled out were providing evidence of systematic abuses that were beginning to generate international pressure for reform of the detention system. Perhaps most satisfying was the news that Dr. Vasquez had specifically requested that her rescuers be commended for their extraordinary courage and effectiveness. She understood better than anyone how difficult and dangerous the operation had been, and she wanted Sarah and Maria to know that their sacrifice had accomplished something truly significant. The teacher who had entered enemy territory alone had not only changed everything for one imprisoned scientist, but had struck a blow for justice that would continue to have effects long after the immediate crisis had passed. As Sarah prepared for the next phase of her mission, the equally dangerous journey back to resistance territory, she reflected on how completely the experience had transformed her understanding of herself and her capabilities. The scared village teacher who had accepted this assignment 6 weeks earlier would never have believed that she could successfully orchestrate a prison break in the heart of enemy territory. Yet she had not only accomplished the impossible, but had done so in a way that left her convinced that even greater challenges could be overcome with sufficient determination and careful planning. The war was far from over, and there would be other missions, other opportunities to serve the cause of freedom and human dignity. But Sarah Chun had already proven something important to herself and to everyone who knew her story. Ordinary people could indeed accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept that extraordinary things were impossible. The teacher had become a hero, not through any miraculous transformation, but simply by choosing to act on the convictions that had always defined her character, thinking constantly about the broader implications of what she was attempting. Dr. Vasquez represented more than just a valuable asset to the resistance. She symbolized the hope that knowledge and expertise could not be permanently suppressed by force. Her rescue would demonstrate that even the most secure facilities could be penetrated by determined individuals working together toward a common goal. The night before the planned operation, Sarah sat in her small room at the boarding house, reviewing every detail of the plan one final time. She thought about her students, both here and back home, and wondered what they would think if they knew what their teacher was planning. She imagined trying to explain to them that sometimes adults had to make very difficult choices, that protecting innocent people sometimes required taking extraordinary risks, and that the lessons taught in classrooms were meaningless unless someone was willing to defend the freedom to learn and think and question authority. A soft knock at her door announced the arrival of her final briefing materials. Maria Santos entered quietly, carrying a medical bag that contained the forged documents and emergency supplies they would need for the following day. The two women spent an hour going over every aspect of the plan, identifying potential problems, and rehearsing their responses to various emergency scenarios. As Maria prepared to leave, she took Sarah's hand and spoke words that would stay with her forever. "I never thought I would do something like this," Maria said quietly. 6 months ago, I was just a guard's wife who complained about the quality of the local shops and worried about my daughter's grades. Now I'm helping to plan a prison escape that could get us all executed. But you know what? I've never felt more like myself than I do right now. Does that make any sense? Sarah understood exactly what Maria meant. The mission had stripped away all the comfortable certainties that had defined her old life, forcing her to discover capabilities and convictions she had never known she possessed. The scared teacher who had left her village a month ago was gone, replaced by someone who could function effectively in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. Whether this transformation was temporary or permanent remained to be seen, but, for now, it was exactly what the situation required. As dawn approached, and the final phase of the mission drew near, Sarah realized that she had already succeeded in ways that went far beyond the official objectives. She had proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept that extraordinary things were impossible. She had demonstrated that teachers, mothers, and other seemingly powerless individuals could become forces for change when they chose to act on their convictions rather than simply hope that someone else would solve the world's problems. Dr. Elena Vasquez was about to discover that rescue was possible even from the heart of enemy territory. More importantly, she was about to learn that her freedom had been won through the courage of two women who had never met her but who understood that some things were worth risking everything to protect. The final test of Sarah's impossible mission was about to begin. The final leg of Sarah's journey took her through the most heavily patrolled territory she had yet encountered. Military vehicles passed every few minutes, and civilian traffic was subjected to random searches that could expose her mission at any moment. She adopted the patient, resigned demeanor of someone accustomed to delays and inconveniences, waiting calmly when ordered to halt, and answering questions with the weary cooperation of a citizen who had learned not to resist authority. As Sarah crested a hill overlooking the valley that contained her destination, she saw the detention camp for the first time. The facility was larger and more formidable than she had imagined, surrounded by high walls topped with wire and overlooked by watchtowers positioned at regular intervals. Vehicles moved constantly in and out of the main gate, and even from her distant vantage point, Sarah could see the disciplined movement of guards patrolling the perimeter. Somewhere within those walls was Dr. Vasquez, a brilliant woman whose knowledge could save countless lives if she could be rescued and returned to the resistance. The camp represented everything that Sarah had been fighting against: the systematic imprisonment of those who dared to resist oppression, the crushing of hope beneath the weight of military might, the reduction of human beings to strategic assets in a larger conflict. Sarah spent the remaining hours of daylight studying the camp through a small pair of binoculars that David had provided. She memorized the timing of guard changes, noted the patterns of vehicle traffic, and identified potential approach routes that might allow someone to get closer to the facility without being detected. The information she gathered would be crucial for the rescue team, but first, she had to find a way to make contact with Dr. Vasquez herself. As darkness fell over the valley, Sarah made her way down the hillside toward the small town that served the detention camp. Her cover story identified her as a teacher assigned to the local school, which would give her a legitimate reason to be in the area while she conducted her intelligence-gathering mission. The next phase of her operation would require her to establish herself as a normal member of the community while secretly planning one of the most audacious rescue attempts of the war. The lights of the town twinkled in the distance as Sarah walked through the gathering darkness. Behind her lay a week of extraordinary challenges that had transformed her from an ordinary village teacher into something she had never imagined she could become. Ahead lay the most dangerous part of her mission, where a single mistake could doom not only herself, but also the woman she had come to save. Sarah Chun was no longer just entering enemy territory. She was now deep within it, preparing to attempt something that military strategists would consider nearly impossible. But she had learned something important during her journey. Ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept that extraordinary things were impossible. Perhaps the most difficult aspect of preparation was emotional. Sarah had to accept that she might not return from this mission. She wrote letters to her parents, who lived in a distant city and knew nothing of her resistance activities. She prepared her classroom for her absence, creating detailed lesson plans that her replacement could follow. Most heartbreaking of all, she said goodbye to her students without being able to tell them why. On her last day of teaching before the mission, Sarah looked around her classroom with new eyes. The simple wooden desks, the blackboard covered with the day's arithmetic problems, the children's drawings pinned to the walls, all of it suddenly seemed precious beyond measure. These children represented everything she was fighting for: the right to learn, to grow up in freedom, to imagine futures that weren't dominated by fear and oppression. As her students filed out that afternoon, chattering about their weekend plans, Sarah felt the weight of her decision settle fully upon her shoulders. In 3 days, she would begin a journey that would take her further from home than she had ever traveled, into dangers she could barely imagine. She would leave behind everything familiar and safe to venture into territory where her very presence marked her as an enemy. That evening, as Sarah packed her few belongings and prepared her teaching materials for their secret purpose, she found herself thinking about courage. She had always admired the heroes in the stories she read to her students, but she had never understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act in spite of fear, to choose what was right even when the cost might be everything you held dear. The village was quiet as Sarah made her final preparations. Through her window, she could see the mountains that had sheltered her community for generations, their peaks silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Somewhere beyond those mountains lay her destination, a place where captured heroes waited for rescue and enemy soldiers patrolled with loaded weapons. Tomorrow night, she would begin the journey that would either save lives or end her own. Sarah Chun, the village school teacher who had never hurt anyone in her life, was about to enter enemy territory alone. She carried with her not just intelligence and mission objectives, but the hopes of everyone who believed that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things. Her students slept peacefully in their beds, unaware that their teacher was about to attempt something that trained soldiers considered nearly impossible. In the morning, she would disappear from their world as quietly as mist, leaving behind only the memory of a woman who had taught them that sometimes the most important lessons happen far from any classroom.